Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session of this series about Maimonides, his philosophy, his cultural context, his life, his legacy. We're so happy to be joined today not only by our interviewer Eliyahu, reprising his role, but also by Lenn Goodman, who is a professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He's the author of various books with a focus on Jewish and Islamic philosophy, as well as philosophy at large. He's an interpreter of Islamic philosophy and thought. Very excited to see what happens today in this, our final session. And feel free to post where you're coming in from in the chat and questions you may have that we can save for the end.
Thank you, Mira. So we're thrilled to end the series with a bang with the Professor Lenn Goodman. So just a reminder to everyone that we'll save the last 20 minutes approximately for questions. So you could send your questions throughout the lecture or wait until the end, and we'll dedicate 20 minutes to that. And so our first question for our distinguished interviewer today, Professor Lenn Goodman, is a question about the road that you took from Al-Ghazali, the subject of your doctoral dissertation, to Maimonides.
That's a great question. I first got into Islamic philosophy when I was at Harvard, and I pursued it at Oxford under the direction of Richard Walzer, who was the main authority in that field back in the 60s when I got started. I see one of the guests here is a fellow student of mine from those days. I see Jane Gerber's name there. Nice to see her. My interest was in two things. My interest was in building bridges between Jews and Arabs, between Muslims and the religion of Judaism from which Islam sprang, intellectually, spiritually, morally, culturally. I had hopes of building those bridges, and I'm beginning to see those hopes fulfilled nowadays, as witnessed my recent wonderful visit to Morocco. But one of the things that I think we need to know if we're interested in religious philosophy in general and Jewish philosophy in particular is that Jewish philosophy is deeply in conversation with Islamic philosophy. So the connection between Al-Ghazali, on whom I did do my doctoral dissertation at Oxford, and Maimonides, is that Al-Ghazali is among the figures that Maimonides read. So is Ibn Tufayl, on whom I did my honors thesis back at Harvard in the first half of the 60s. And Maimonides learned from those figures. He learned particularly from Al-Farabi, as well as those two from Avicenna. He learned from the experimentation with philosophical ideas by the Islamic movement of the Kalam, and he felt that they had gotten off onto a wrong track because their arguments were tendentious. And he said, quoting a Greek philosopher that he read in translation, we have to build our ideas on we have to build our conception of the world on the facts about the world and on rational arguments, not just on our wishes of how we hope that things will turn out. So Maimonides himself got his philosophical education in good part by studying Islamic philosophy, the better kind and the kind that he didn't have much high regard for. He had high regard for Al-Farabi, not so much for the Kalam, because their logic was faulty. So I followed that track. I studied Islamic philosophy seriously, and I still work actively in that field. But I have more of an existential commitment to Jewish philosophy. I'm an active contributor in the field of Jewish philosophy, and I'm interested in Maimonides partly because he can show us in terms of method, in terms of commitment, in terms of values, how Jewish philosophy can work, how it should work when it's done as he did it in the 12th century in the best possible way that it could be done based on the science of those days and the logic, which hasn't changed much since those days.
Thank
Does that
you.
help? I can say more, but oh yes, I see that kind of picture that you see in your machberet when you go to Hebrew school. Those pictures and the wonderful image in Cordoba that visitors to Cordoba get to see are entirely fanciful, of course. We don't have a physical image of Maimonides. Undoubtedly, he wore a turban. That was the sign of respectability in his time. We know he wore a beard for similar reasons. He does say that a monarch of Israel should be sure to have his beard trimmed regularly, so he shouldn't look harried and disheveled. That's part of the dignity of monarchy. But the real dignity of monarchy, Maimonides believes, is represented by the throne, which sits foursquare on the ground, in order to show by its stability something emblematic of the justice on which the legitimacy of a throne depends. And he thinks, where he had some Muslim theological predecessors who thought that God actually sits on a throne, Maimonides does not take that idea very seriously. He doesn't think that God has a body. He thinks that's a very primitive way of thinking based on sensation and imagination. But the stability of the throne represents the legitimacy of divine rule. Maimonides says that God's justice is inseparable from God's identity. It's not a separate attribute. It is who he is in very 21st century kind of language there. That's who God is. God is the power and the grace and the wisdom and the justice that he exercises in the world. So that dignity, which represented by external markings like the turban or the beard or the throne, is an outward representation of something inner and more profound and more real, which is attributes like justice and grace and wisdom.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, with this visual comparison, to what extent are the problems that Maimonides deals with in the Guide to the Perplexed, where he's helping the educated Jew deal with conflicts that may arise between religion and philosophy, to what extent are these the same problems philosophically that a Muslim philosopher like Al-Ghazali was working on at the same time or similar timing?
They are the same problems, and they're the same problems that are alive today. We have questions about the relationship of religion and science, for example. The science in Maimonides' day was not the science that we have today. And Maimonides himself did not believe in the decline of the generations. He believed that there's progress in mathematics, in astronomy, in the sciences. There were astronomical problems that he and his contemporaries tried hard to work on and were not able to solve successfully. You needed to get rid of geocentrism to do that, and that was a pretty radical move for his day. But the brightest minds of his generation, among whom Maimonides should be counted, tried to solve those problems. Maimonides, in the end, in astronomy, took a position that philosophers call instrumentalism. We have a mathematical model of how the heavens work, but if we try to turn that into a physical model, we find it doesn't work at all. Or we can predict eclipses using Ptolemaic astronomy to the minute of the occlusion of the heavenly bodies, when it starts, when it finishes. But our model is just mathematics. That's a way we have to deal with a problem. It's analogous to the way physicists today try to deal with problems of quantum physics, where we have a mathematical model, but we don't really have a way of mapping that onto a physical representation of the way the world works. Think about problems like the problem of evil. If God is good and God is all-powerful and all-knowing, why is there suffering of innocence? Why do people who seem to be wicked seem to prosper in this world? That problem is a perennial problem. Maimonides has important things to say about it, of course, in connection with the book of Job, where the Tanakh itself deals with that question. Problems about the nature of revelation was especially interesting for the Rambam. If God is infinite and all wise, all good, how does God's infinite perfection translate itself into a system of norms and prescriptions that human individuals can live by? We're limited both in our lifespan and in our powers and in our cultural background and historical context. How does God scale down the demands of absolute and infinite perfection to make them accessible to human beings? That's a question about revelation. Maimonides talks about it under the heading of prophecy. How does God communicate with us? How can we regard the Torah as being the word of God when we know that God doesn't have a larynx and a tongue and lips? Those are just imaginative representations. That's the kind of problem that's a living problem today. Problems about God's justice, problems about the nature of revelation, problems about if you think that God knows everything, does that imply that everything is already determined? Maimonides doesn't think it does, but that's a philosophical problem that philosophers and thoughtful people in general today still have to deal with and figure out how to handle it. Those are universal problems. And one of the reasons that Maimonides is worth studying today is because the problems he addresses and the methods he uses and the intellectual honesty and rigor he uses in addressing them are valuable models for us. Not that we're going to copy everything that he said. We don't agree that the earth is at the center of the world, the bowels of the universe, as people thought of it. But we do know that understanding the physical nature of the universe and the intellectual nature of humankind and the moral and spiritual nature of our condition remain issues to be explored. And those are the issues that Maimonides centrally focused on in the Guide to the Perplexed.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, in relation to those philosophers or those Islamic specialists who view Maimonides as a great philosopher of the Middle Ages, how is it important to understand him as a Jewish philosopher?
Several things that you can notice about Maimonides. He's very committed to his Judaism. We do have evidence that in that bad period when you could get killed for being a Jew by the Almohads, who conquered southern Spain, conquered Cordoba, when Maimonides, who lived in Cordoba with his family as a boy, was just 10 years old. He was born 1138. 1148, the Almohads conquered Cordoba. The family were in various states of hiding. The evidence is they did notionally and nominally commit to Islam. Joel Kramer has assembled that evidence very successfully in his fine book on Maimonides. One piece of that evidence is a little essay that Maimonides wrote as a young man, where he confesses in the words of the prophet, the Jewish prophet, we lie down in our sin, we and our fathers. He's confessing indirectly that his own family were pretending to be Muslims. And pretending to be Muslims, he says, we didn't have to worship idols or anything like that. These people are monotheists too, but we don't really accept their prophet. And he has some pretty clear, if slightly veiled, remarks about the Prophet of Islam, showing that he did not consider that prophecy to be the kind of ultimate prophecy that Muslims believe it to be. But his Judaism is very evident in particularly in the 13 Articles of Belief, which is part of his commentary on the Mishnah in Perennial, for those of you who study the Mishnah. He wants to understand how it's possible for the Mishnah to say that all Israel, and according to the Tosefta, the righteous of all nations, have a share in the world to come. Well, his reasoning is that the way you get a share in the world to come, the way you attain spiritual immortality, is by connecting intellectually, strengthening and realizing your affinity with God, which is represented by the line in Genesis, the verse which says that human beings, male and female, were created in the image of God. That image, he says, isn't a picture, it isn't a representation of a divine face. The image of God represents the substantial form of humanity, which is reason. That's what we have in common with God. And if we strengthen that enough by study and discipline, we can make that relationship permanent, and that's how we get immortality. The problem being that not everybody, not all Israel, not all the righteous of all nations, have the philosophical chops to strengthen that bond enough. So the question, are we going to be an elitist to the extent that we deny people who are not philosophers the access to immortality that the Mishnah promises in Perennial? The answer that Maimonides finds, with some help from the Islamic tradition and particularly some help from Plato, is that you don't have to be a philosopher if you have beliefs which can serve as a surrogate for knowledge. True belief, Plato says in the famous dialogue, the Meno, true belief can get you to Larissa, even if you don't know how to navigate the way. True belief, for most practical purposes, is just as good as knowledge. And beliefs, according to Maimonides, are instilled in us in part by practice. For example, observance of the Sabbath instills two beliefs in us. One is the creation of the world, and the other is the providence of God. Those are the things which the Torah itself says are symbolized by the rituals and the observances that we hold in regard to the Sabbath. So those practices can give us beliefs, and the beliefs will stand in for knowledge. So we don't have to be able to reason our way there the way a philosopher would. We have to have access to that kind of light and enlightenment through belief, and belief through practice. The ethical principles of Judaism will give you surrogates of that knowledge. That's a marvelous idea, and it opens up. It exonerates Maimonides from the charge of being a kind of philosophical elitist. It opens up the possibility of being of everyone being in some measure intellectually fulfilled by beliefs and by practices which everyone can have in common. Now, those beliefs and practices, to get right to the heart of your question, those beliefs and practices are the beliefs and practices of Judaism. It might be done by others in a different way, moral counterparts and intellectual counterparts of those same ideas. But he does believe that the Torah is the best example of a divinely revealed pattern of life and thought and belief and behavior, which will perfect your character, and a perfected character is the seedbed on which that intellectual capability can grow. Another metaphor he picks up from the book of Proverbs is the idea of a golden ball which is encased in a silver casement. the casement is a filigree of the kind that he says that craftsmen make, and it has eyelets in it. So to the casual observer or the hasty observer, it looks like a silver ball. If you look more closely and study it more carefully, you'll find out that there's a golden ball inside that silver ball. That is, he says, the way the Torah works. So not only do beliefs and practices instill beliefs, and beliefs become the eyelets through which you can see something, as he puts it, more precious than the outward practices, namely that intellectual bond which connects you with God and assures you the road to immortality. One final image I think is very good. You know in Genesis how it says that when Adam and Eve were barred from the Garden of Eden, there's a glittering sword threw it up, which is spinning. And Maimonides, quite unlike the casual reader of that passage, casual reader thinks that sword bars the way. But Maimonides thinks of the glittering as a result of the spinning. There's light coming from inside that special place, and the light is like a strobe light on a police car. It flashes on and off. If you attach yourself to that light by those moral and intellectual and spiritual means, you find your way back. He doesn't think that this glittering sword bars the way to eternal life. He thinks it's still there, which everyone can pursue. And the way you pursue it, I emphasize once again in answering your question about what's Jewish about it, the way you pursue it is by practicing the rituals and the moral laws, the ceremonial laws of the Torah, which inculcate a certain kind of character, which is the seed bed for that intellectual perfection, which leads everyone in some measure, according to their own abilities, to connection with God.
Well, thank you. You write in the introduction of your new translation of the Guide to the Perplexed that in his time, some of Maimonides' ideas were considered radical, but over the centuries, they became so perhaps associated with Jewish belief that they became traditional. That I was hoping you could give an example of an idea, and its time was radical, but it's now become traditional.
Yes, that's a great question. There's an idea which is deeply embedded in the Guide to the Perplexed, and which is sort of coded in the opening words of the Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah, of course, the 14-volume codification of Jewish law by the Rambam, because Rambam was a physician, an author of 10 medical works, several of them in multiple volumes, and a major jurist, probably the most authoritative and creative Jewish jurist since the time of the Talmud itself. And people still study his 14-volume code of law religiously. And in the opening passage of that 14-volume code, he talks about the ultimate thing that you need to know is the reality of God, and he thinks that kind of knowledge realizes that implicit connection with God that we all have as our which is our human reason, and he thinks that realizing that connection is the road to immortality. That's an idea which, at various stages of Jewish intellectual history, did seem very radical. It sounded strange to some people. There were many people, and Maimonides himself speaks disparagingly about them, who thought that prayer and fasting is what amounts to piety. He thought that prayer and fasting, and indeed even the moral laws of the Torah, are a means to an end. That's the way to purify your character to attain ultimate felicity, which is the knowledge of God. That view has been today much more widely accepted among very traditional Jews, including Jews that you might associate with the ones who were suspicious of that idea in the early stages. It's a remarkable thing. The more they thought about it, and of course there were those who disagreed even then, even now, but the more they thought about it, the more traditional Jews saw the wisdom of that idea that knowing God is the goal of human fulfillment. And one of the things that they like to point out as a kind of code, the opening couple of sentences of the Mishneh Torah, the Maimonidean code, it has the first few words contain the initials of the Tetragrammaton, Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh, as we like to say, the four-letter name of God, which he thinks represents divine absoluteness. So there's a kind of a mantra built into that opening passage of his code of law, hinting to you that we don't study Torah as an end in itself. We study Torah as a means to an end in order to perfect ourselves and achieve through that perfection the knowledge of God. I think that's a very striking example of something which initially was viewed by many with suspicion, but today is widely accepted as a profound truth. And there are many more examples, but that's a pretty good one.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about Maimonides and monotheism, specifically the figure Abraham,
Yes,
whom we know he had a special connection with. As you note in your introduction, he named his son Abraham.
he did.
He visited Abraham's tomb in the city of Hebron.
Yes.
Went on a brief trip to the land of Israel. So if you could speak about what Maimonides saw in the figure of Abraham and monotheism.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. Start with this. Abraham didn't get his religion from tradition. Nobody taught Abraham that there is one God and that he's transcendent and that one God is not just the sun or the earth or the sky, but something beyond anything that we can see. Abraham, to Maimonides, represents somebody who had to figure those things out for himself, and indeed had to figure them out in the face of persecution and disparagement and dismissal. And he likes the midrashic stories about how Abraham was persecuted for his belief, and he was persecuted for promoting his belief. He doesn't think that Abraham was a prophet like Moses. Abraham never gave a law. He taught people both by precept and by example. And Sarah was with him in all of that. Maimonides makes a point of saying that. But Abraham didn't say, God sent me to tell you to do this. He taught. He acquired souls, as the Midrash puts it, by precept and by example. But the idea that rational inquiry led Abraham to the discovery of the oneness and absolute and transcendence of God, absoluteness and transcendence of God, that's a remarkable thing. He lives at a time when most people get their religion from tradition. That is how most people get their religion even today. You follow the religion of your parents, and if you abandon the religion of your parents, you follow the religion of somebody else's parents. And if you abandon that, maybe you abandon all religion. Then you fall into some other kind of social milieu in which you tend to follow the familiar path that's accepted as if it had always been there. Abraham is an iconoclast, not just in the sense of the midrashic story about his breaking his father's idols, but in a deeper sense that he has to think for himself. And Abraham, in that regard, represents the philosophical theologian, the rational theologian, as opposed to the civil theologian who bases his ideas of God on what's socially acceptable. In contrast with the traditionalist who, you can ask many traditionalists today, many Orthodox people, if you ask them, do you believe in God? Well, you're supposed to. It's a mitzvah that you have to believe in God. Oh, that's very nice. That's very sweet. But that would not cut much ice with Maimonides. After all, as he points out, pagans too follow tradition. Their parents taught them that way, and this is the way they're supposed to live, and they have their own version of piety and their own version of what's right and wrong. Following that way is very different from thinking for yourself. That was the real ideal that Maimonides had. It was something that he admired about Andalusian culture, whether Jewish or Islamic, that Andalusians tended to want to reason, tended to want to understand. That's why some of his earliest studies, beyond astronomy, he was studying logic. And he wrote a little book about logic. He wanted to understand the rules that can guide reasons. Reasoning? Why are these rules normative? Why are they binding? How can we use them to discriminate sound arguments from fallacies? That's what he wants to do. And he says, following Plato and others, we have to follow where the argument leads. That's what we Andalusians do. Interesting, having been exiled from Cordoba at the age of 10, he still thinks of himself, calls himself an Andalusian. And that's what that background represents to him. It represents reasoning, not just in philosophy and logic and science, but also in halakha, because his father and his father's teachers came from a rationalistic reading of halakha. That Ibn Migash and so forth, the school of Lucena, which was founded by Al-Fazi, that is the kind of tradition that Maimonides identifies with. He's always, he takes as a motto a line from the Psalms. And the line, like many of his quotations from the Tanakh, is read in a particularly creative way. The line in Hebrew is, Az lo evosh behibiti al kol mitzvotecha. Then shall I be unabashed to scrutinize all thy commandments. And that he takes as the goal of his code of law, that he's going to show you why all these mitzvot make sense, why it's appropriate for us to observe these laws and prescriptions, moral, ceremonial, legal, property law, criminal law. All of these things make sense. And if you understand the reasoning behind them, you'll know how to follow them. You'll know how to interpret them if your job is to interpret them. That's what Abraham represents to the Rambam, and that, I think, is why he went out of his way. Of course, he wanted to visit Jerusalem. He wanted to visit the site of the temple, but he also wanted to go to Hebron because, as you say, that was the first spot where Avraham Avinu, the patriarch Abraham, bought a piece of land from the Hittite to bury Sarah after her death.
So you began translating Maimonides with the book published in 1976.
Yes.
Now here we are with the new edition of The God of the Perplexed. And as you shared with me, Maimonides discusses how to translate. So yes. I'm wondering if you speak about your journey translating this brilliant philosopher.
Well, since I'm a philosopher myself, I see beauty as well as brilliance in his reasoning. And I want to capture that beauty, the logical beauty of the structure of that argument, just as a person who's an opera buff will go to the opera and will appreciate not only the sensuous beauty of the voices of the singers on the stage, but also the intricacy that Mozart or Verdi has put into that music. To a philosopher, good reasoning sounds like good music. And to a philosopher, poor reasoning sounds like music that's off tune. I will say I spent about 10 years translating and no, not 10. I was first asked to do that book, that 1976 book in 1970. So I spent 6 years on that book. This one has taken a lot longer. I can tell you my Arabic is a lot better. One of the things you have to do, and Maimonides says you have to do it, translate for sense. Translate for sense, not just for imitating the syntax and the vocabulary of the original. Words can have multiple meanings in different contexts. That's one of the big themes of the guide itself, because he's interpreting the Torah and he sees the variance in the words in the Torah, how the Torah uses words in poetic ways to convey something which is out of reach for us in a literal sense, which is the idea of the transcendent, of the idea of God. So the Torah always uses various metaphors which deconstruct one another or deconstruct themselves in order to point beyond themselves to a being of absolute perfection. But when you translate the Arabic of the Rambam or of any good philosopher, one of the things you have to see is how does that sentence make sense? How does it fit into its context? What is it assuming? What is who's targeted here if there's any kind of irony or edge to the reasoning that's going on? You have to translate for sense. I learned from Sir Hamilton Gibb, who was one of my Arabic teachers, a very famous Arabist at Harvard. I learned from him that you don't need to pay attention to word order. You need to pay attention to what emphasis a sentence has. What's the point of the sentence? Rambam says the same thing in his letter to Ibn Tibbon, which he wrote towards the end of his life. You can see in the subtext of that letter, he thinks that Ibn Tibbon was being a bit too literal, and a bit too slavish, and he emphasizes that. One thing that you'll find if you try your hand at translating from any language, you might see two sentences that look like they're saying much the same thing. If it's good philosophy, that philosopher is not just repeating himself or herself. If it's good philosophy, there might be intended an implication there. Maybe one sentence is meant to follow from another. They're easy to overlook those little particles of so or therefore or indeed or except, where the argument is being shaped. It's not just sort of rattling on. That's a sensitivity you have to acquire. I can tell you, I have friends who still love that 1976 book, but my Arabic is much better than it was in those days. I once asked Gibb. he told that someone had asked him. It wasn't I. Someone had asked him how long it took him to learn Arabic, and Gibb at that time was a university professor, man in his 70s. He said, "I'm still working on it." Arabic is a very rich language, and everyone who writes in Arabic has his or her own vocabulary and his or her own regional dialect. That's certainly true of Judeo-Arabic, which is the Arabic written in Hebrew characters and sometimes with Hebrew words interpolated into it. You've got to adjust yourself to the intentions of the author, and you've got to open yourself to what's on his mind. Who's he got in mind? Who's he answering? What question is he addressing? Maimonides will not tell you when he talks about the book of Job that he's talking about the problem of evil. It's not a standard piece like it is in a college course nowadays. That's an easy one. We know if you're talking about the book of Job, you're talking about the problem of evil. But most people who read the first few dozen chapters of the Guide to the Perplexed do not know what the subject matter of those chapters is. They think that Maimonides is trying to refute anthropomorphism. You know, it's a funny thing if you're a philosopher. He has no argument against anthropomorphism in those first few dozen chapters. He doesn't really have an argument against it until about the middle of part one. He doesn't announce that he has an argument against anthropomorphism till the beginning of book two, I shouldn't say book, of part two of the Guide to the Perplexed. He's assuming that anthropomorphism is false. What's he doing there? One of the things I had to work out is if he hasn't yet presented an argument, why all that discussion of the terminology that the Torah applies to God? He wants to show you that all of the terms applied to God in the first, he surveys all the terms applied to God, ascending and descending and, face and back, you name it, all the anthropomorphic terms. All those anthropomorphic terms have multiple senses. And he wants to show you that those multiple senses have a gradation from the physical to the social and moral to the intellectual. And that gradation is the subtext of those early chapters. The subtext in the sense that they're pointing the way so that when he goes ahead and tells you, finally, that the notion of divine attributes is worse than polytheism and more hateful to God. He uses that metaphor, which is itself an anthropomorphism, more hateful to God than polytheism. But when you get to that point of developing what he calls his negative theology, that the more you know about God, the less you can say about God. When he develops that point, he doesn't want to leave you up the creek without a paddle. He has left you with an orientation from the physical to the spiritual and intellectual. He identifies the spiritual with the intellectual so that you'll know that the more transcendent term is always the more transcendent sense is always the right sense to apply a term in when you're dealing with God. That is a problem that he doesn't name, he doesn't state it. If you've worried about such things, if you're worried about the question of how does the Torah get away with talking about God walking in the garden and talking to Adam and Eve and so forth, the worry will clue you in to the fact that he has provided an answer to that problem. But as the rabbis say in the Talmud, if you don't have the problem, you won't get the answer, because you have to be able to see how his approach is answering a question that he's going to leave you with when he denies that God has any attributes and that there really is no proper way of speaking about God, but Torah has to use human language and talk about the creator in the language that's more applicable to the creature, which is to say that the Torah is all poetry, and you have to know how to decipher that poetry in order to read the Torah intelligently. There's a problem.
Thank you.
That probably doesn't name.
We got a lot of good questions today. So let's see how many we could get through. Maybe if we could ask you, Professor, to answer some of them a little bit more briefly this time. So the first question is from Uriel, which is, what was the most surprising fact that you discovered about Maimonides in your translation work?
Well, I mentioned one that came as a surprise to me. I did not initially want to believe that Maimonides had, in fact, pretended to be a Muslim. Like Herbert Davidson, who was a good scholar of Maimonides, He wants to dismiss that suspicion. However, as I said earlier on, Joel Kramer assembled all the evidence, and the evidence is very clear that he did spend years pretending to be a Muslim. It wasn't safe to be anything else for a while. I don't believe that he ever was a Muslim, but if that had been discovered, it was a capital charge. And fortunately, when he was in Egypt and under the protection of the man who put Saladin on the throne, a man called Al-Qadi al-Fadl, someone showed up who had known him in the East and said, wait a minute, this man was a Muslim back in the Maghrib. And that was a capital charge. You were subject to death in this world and damnation in the next. Fortunately for him, his patron, whom he served as a physician, Al-Qadi al-Fadl, heard the case himself and dismissed it on the grounds that, according to the Quran, there's no compulsion, there's no coercion in matters of faith. It's something that the Almohad regime did not accept, but the Almohad regime, fortunately, was not in charge in Egypt, where Al-Qadi al-Fadl was the eminence grise of Saladin's regime and had great admiration for Maimonides. So, but I had to recognize that there was that phase of his life, and I can tell you from my recent trip to Morocco, people in Morocco are still proud of the fact that Maimonides lived in Morocco. They don't claim he was a Muslim at that time, but they're proud of the fact that this great thinker was one of those Andalusian and Moroccan, Maghribi, Western thinkers of their community. And anyway, that was one of the surprising things indeed.
Thank you. Renee asks, how would Maimonides have felt about not gendering God? I'll just add myself that this has been in the news lately. There's a new translation of the entire Tanakh by the Jewish Publication Society.
I've seen reference to it, yeah.
So this was not an issue necessarily in Maimonides' day, but how do you think he would have felt about it?
Oh, I know exactly how he would have felt about it. It was implied in something I said earlier. He thought that it was worse than idolatry to assign any proper predicate to God. If you want to say God is wise, that is no better than saying God is soft-hearted. It's still projecting your own imaginative images onto God. Now, you have to know, as I learned from my mother when I was a little boy, my mother was an English professor, you have to know that the use of the word he, contrary to some of our feminist friends, and I was the son of a feminist and married to the woman who was the head of women's studies at the University of Hawaii for 31 years. You have to know, contrary to some of our feminists who are hung up on questions of language, that the word he, as it's used in English language, according to our grammar, is not a gendered pronoun. They like to make a fuss about it and say that it is. But in English, you're not going to call God it. That's a stupid mistake. You're not going to call God they, which is going to get you into all kinds of problems about subject-verb agreement. Maimonides did not believe that God had any properties, let alone anthropomorphic corporeal properties like having a sex. The grammatical gender of the word he is not gender marked in the way that sexual terms are. So I think that what the JPS did is quailing in the front of political correctness without really understanding the grammar of the language that they profess to be able to use.
Thank you. Ellen Kramer asks, I wonder what Maimonides would say about faith in God after the Holocaust.
Well, you got to remember that the Holocaust was a unique event. But in the Rambam's time, it was not a unique event. He lived through comparable events, different in scale. But if you want to say that the most advanced civilization of the day turned its full resources against the continued existence of the Jewish people and of others whom they declared to be their enemies, he lived through that. The suffering of innocence, I don't want to diminish the idea of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. It was a unique event, but it was unique mainly in its scale and its systematic nature. The idea, as I learned from Yehuda Bauer back in the day when he was lecturing on Holocaust studies, lots of PhDs in the SS, the Waffen SS, lots of intellectuals. Intellectuals, as Plato acknowledged, are terrible conformists and opportunists. So the idea that nothing like this had happened in Maimonides' time is both true and false. As it says in the Passover Haggadah, "Say lamad ma bikesh lavad harmi." Go learn how many times the same sort of thing has happened to us and to other innocent victims. We know that Maimonides did not think that the destruction of Andalusian Jewry, in which he and his family were victims, was a betrayal by God of the covenant. He did not believe that it was a mark of the failure of God or the impotence of God. He believed that the evils that humans do to one another are their own doing. It's not, for example, he says about the book of Job, which is the archetype of any undeserved suffering. He says it's a mistake to suppose that God visited those sufferings, those undeserved sufferings upon Job. That was something that happened because of Hasatan, and he glosses Hasatan as matter. Your embodiment gives you both the opportunity to advance and perfect your mind and the vulnerability to disease, to humanly perpetrated evil, to all sorts of deficits, some of which are your own doing and some of which are the doing of others. He does not think that there's a uniquely theological problem about the Holocaust. And I would add that from a Maimonidean point of view, those who try to exploit the uniqueness of the Holocaust in order to push a theological argument that it somehow involves the death of God or the impotence of God are riding their own little wagon. They're using this terrible event to liberate themselves from responsibility to God. Maimonides would not regard that as a wholesome or appropriate response to unmitigated and unmerited evil. He saw plenty of that in his own time. Remember disease in his time. He's treating patients, both at the court and at home, private patients. He sees lots of undeserved suffering. In addition to having suffered it, in addition to seeing his world destroyed back in Al-Andalus in southern Spain. He saw all of that, and he's not in denial about it, but he's not trying to make a hobby horse out of it in order to push a theological view, which he thinks is a false view.
Thank you. If we can ask you in 1 minute or 2 minutes, somebody asked about Spinoza. So if you could explain the difference between Maimonides and Spinoza on the creation of the world in 1 minute.
Let me tell you, I happen to be a great lover of Spinoza and a great admirer of Spinoza. I have friends like Richard Cohen and great scholars of our own time and thinkers of our own time who think of Spinoza as the arch heretic. I think that's wrong. Spinoza, in many ways, continues what Maimonides started. He's radicalized by his falling away from the Jewish community and their need to exclude him because of threat that they were under from the Dutch Reformed Church and the environment that they lived in under tolerance of the first steps of attempting to be liberal in some small way in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands had gotten out from under the thumb of Spain. Spinoza, in many ways, continues the work of Maimonides. Wolfson has shown how he departs from it. I have shown in a big 87-page paper, which I can't summarize in 1 minute, the abiding Jewish themes in Spinoza, some of which are really connected with Maimonides. Yes, it's true. Spinoza rejected the idea of the creation of the world. He rejected the idea of the incorporeality of God. Maimonides hints that, and I wrote a paper about this, Maimonides hints that God's will is to be associated with matter, and God's wisdom is to be associated with ideas, with form. And in God, in reality, those two are really one and the same. Although in the world, of course, as we apprehended it, they're not. Spinoza's idea that the two attributes that he ascribes to God that we know about, thought and extension, are both expressions of God. And the way he uses the word expression is analogous to the way the Torah uses the idea of creation. So Maimonides' spirited defense of the idea of creation does have a family resemblance to Spinoza's idea of divine expression. I think that there are many people about who have only read a couple of rude remarks that Spinoza wrote about Jews and Judaism in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and haven't actually studied the ethics at all. And I commend to them the book that Heidi Ravin and I put out called Jewish Themes in Spinoza's Philosophy, and particularly I think it's an 87-page essay I wrote marking 13 different ways in which Spinoza is a faithful exponent of Jewish principle. I'll mention just one. Spinoza equates, when he's defining the different virtues, he equates humanitas, which is human caring, with pietas, the Latin word for moral virtue. He equates the two. And if you look at the definitions of those terms as he defines them in formal ways in the ethics, you'll find that what connects them is the biblical idea of chesed, which means grace, loving kindness, it's usually translated. The reason that Spinoza can understand piety in his moral sense as being identical with humaneness in his social sense is from his Hebrew background, because he knows that chesed is the way in which we realize our moral character as human beings.